Hello, in today's video, we will be going over hot end selection for your printer. Now, the three hot ends you see in front of you here, the Slice Mosquito, the V6, and the Triangle Labs Dragons, these are the three hot ends that are currently supported by the Voron ecosystem. Now, if you are building a printer other than a Voron, these three hot ends are also excellent choices, and I will be going over some of the pros and cons of each of these hot ends. What this video will not be, though, is a direct comparison between print quality between the three hot ends, because personally, I do believe all these are good hot ends. If you take the time to tune a slicer profile, properly test and modify that profile for each of these hot ends in your printer, and the printer has a good motion system, is well built, I do believe all three of these hot ends will produce roughly the same print quality. In fact, so close of a print quality that you probably will never really notice any major difference, and the average person will probably never be able to tell which hot end produced each print. So I'm not going to parade a bunch of benchies in front of the camera here and compare minute details between them. What I will be going over, though, are other factors that will drive your choice to picking one of these three hot ends for your printer. Now, I will note that both these are actually the V1 version of both the Dragon and the Mosquito. Both of these have received upgrades since I've purchased these, redesigns to the heat sink and heat break, I believe. But from what I've seen, just consider that the new version is more reliable and maybe a slightly better. But pretty much functionally, I believe they are both the same. So the first thing we're going to be looking at here is cost. Now, for cost, I'm going to use United States dollars across the board and not factor in shipping. Depending on what country you're in, what time of the year it is, pre-Rona, post-Rona, prices are going to vary. With the Slice Mosquito for the standard version, you are looking at around $150 USD. For the V6, you are looking at, between the E3D version, you're looking at approximately $70. And for the Triangle Labs version, you're looking at about $10 for the hot end, and then about $5 for a titanium heat break upgrade. The E3D version does not come with a stock titanium heat break. And then for the Triangle Labs Dragon, you are looking at approximately $60 US, and it does come with the plated copper nozzle. I will not be going over heater cartridges, thermistors, or nozzles. All three of these hot ends do support the same ecosystem of those items, so I will not be reviewing those. This video is just on the hot ends themselves. So for mounting your thermistor and your heater, the V6 and the Dragon both have a similar style, whereas the heater is clamped into position, and then the thermistor or PT100 probe is held in with a grub screw. Now with the Mosquito, you do have to use this boron nitride thermal paste to hold your thermistor and your heater cartridge in. The screws that you see on each end are simply to prevent it from falling out if the paste becomes loose, because once you install it with the paste, it does harden over time and it does become a firm hold on the thermistor and the heater cartridge. So the stated advantage of the boron nitride thermal paste is it does give a full 360 envelope and heat absorption from the heater into the metal, and also heat transfer from the metal into the thermistor. So that is stated as an advantage. However, in practicality, I don't really notice too much of a difference. I don't know if between the thousands of hours I have on the Mosquito and a V6, I really can't tell if this is that big of an advantageous system, and if it does outweigh the negatives of having to use this paste. Removing the heater and the thermistor can be an issue because this does harden up and it does make a mess when installing. It doesn't make swapping these items quick and easy. It does turn them into a process. Also, on the block style such as this, you do have your thermistor quite a ways away from your heater cartridge, whereas on the Slice Mosquito, we do have the thermistor right next to the heater cartridge. The advantage of doing it this way is you do have a more accurate temperature reading of the heater, which does, in my opinion, lead to more stable temperatures. Now, some do say on the block style, such on the V6 and the Dragon, by having the temperature probe on the opposite side of the heater cartridge with the filament path in the way, you are taking a temperature reading through the filament. Some argue that that is a better way of taking your temperature. Either way, though, once you have these installed, PID tuned, and then you run a temperature tower and you calibrate your temperatures to the print quality and results that you want, once they're tuned and up and running, there really is no perfectly functional difference between the two. I found between switching from a V6 to a Mosquito, my temperature graph was a little bit more stable with the Mosquito versus the V6. However, print quality really, I couldn't tell any functional difference between temperature output of the plastic and any improvement or impact to print quality. Now, another thing to take into account with the heater block is the actual melt zone of each of these hot ends. These are all 3 standard flow hot ends. And if you take a look, you would think the hot end melt zone would be from the top of the block to the bottom of the nozzle on all 3. However, the way they are designed is actually quite different. On both the Mosquito and the Dragon, the melt zone is actually from the top of the copper here to the bottom of the nozzle. And again, from the top of the copper to the bottom of the nozzle. So if you take a look inside, you will see that the nozzle is actually touching copper. And then you have the heat break. So what that means is you have even heat distribution from the block, from the point of the heat break all the way down to where the plastic is extruded. So in terms of melt zone size, for standard flow, the Mosquito is the largest, followed by the Dragon. Now, if you look at a V6 style, you do have heat transference from the block into the nozzle, but if you look up, that is titanium. This is a titanium heat break. So in essence, you have very good heat transfer from aluminum into the brass, and then not so good heat transfer from aluminum into the titanium heat break, because the heat break is made out of titanium to prevent heat creep. So when it comes to the size of the melt zone on your 3 hot ends, the Mosquito is the best and the V6 is the worst, in my opinion. Now moving up, we have the heat break. Now this is the portion where we want to basically stop the heat transfer as much as possible, as quickly as possible. So on again, both the Dragon and the Mosquito, the filament path is a very, very thin stainless steel surgical tube, whereas on the V6, we have the titanium heat break continues up into the heatsink, and then it's taken over by your PTFE tube further up. Now, if you look at the size of the heat sinks themselves, on both the Dragon and the Mosquito, they are comparably much smaller than the V6, but they're also made of copper and much thinner than the V6. Now, in terms of practical cooling and the ability to fight heat creep, when I ran a V6 in my Voron V2 enclosed printing ABS, so I had a 240 degree nozzle and a roughly 50 degrees Celsius ambient temperature, I had to run a 40-20 millimeter server grade fan to fight heat creep, and that's also with a titanium heatsink. With these guys, a plain Jane 4010 style axial fan off AliExpress has 0 issues, and I know people printing enclosed with these guys with 30 millimeter fans without issue. So in terms of how good the heatsink works at dissipating heat, these two are miles ahead of the V6. Now, all 3 do work, especially now with the latest revision of the V2 with the afterburner that has much more airflow available. So the heat creep issues of previous Vorons with the V6 are pretty much a thing of the past. However, it still shows how much more airflow this thing needs to prevent heat creep versus these two, because these two will be fine with a 30mm fan all day in an enclosed chamber, printing ABS. Now, another thing I'm going to touch on here is the way that the heat blocks attach to the heatsink. Now, looking at these hot ends, these two look roughly the same size. It's a little bit bigger, but this is just a mounting point. So you would think that they're all roughly the same. However, looking at both of these, the black portion here isn't actually required at all for printing. These are simply mounts. Whereas this whole thing is needed. And the way that the hot end is attached to your printer is through this black aluminum frame here. But these don't serve any purpose when it comes to actually printing. They're not heat sinks. These are not your heat sinks. The copper portion is your heat sink. These are to mount, and they do dissipate some heat because they do receive some heat through the screw mounts and standoffs for attaching your heater block to them. But the beauty of the design of these two is it makes your heat break and your heat sink non-structural items. So you can make them much thinner, much lighter, and it allows them to bleed off the heat much more quickly than a V6. Now, on a V6, your heat break is structural. So on the standard flow, if you have a nozzle strike, you crash the nozzle. I've seen these bend, okay? And also, because they are now structural, they have to be able to take any force on the heater block. So a nozzle strike, nozzle crash. So that means they have to be a little bit thicker. So that means more mass, means more heat transferring from the heater block to the heat sink, and also more heat creep. With these are thin. The heat breaks are very thin if you look at them. So another reason that the rigid mounting is the best way of attaching a heat block to your printer is one-handed nozzle changes. So on both the Dragon and the Mosquito, you can do a one-handed nozzle change. So with this mounted in your printer, you simply unscrew your nozzle and torque it back to spec. Now, Mosquito's claims that you do not need to hot tighten your nozzle. I personally have done dozens of nozzle changes without hot tightening it and had zero leak issues. On the Dragon, I don't have as many hours, so I can't verify that, but they are mechanically the same, so they should function the same. On the V6, you have to heat tighten them. And also, you do not have one-handed nozzle changes because of the way it's constructed, where everything screws together. And this screws into this block, this screws into this block. The heat sink, the heat break screws into the heat sink. When you go to undo it, you don't know what's coming loose. Your heat break can unscrew from the heat sink. Your nozzle could unscrew from the heat block, which is what you want, but also the block can unscrew from the heat break as well. So when you do a nozzle change on a V6, you have to get a wrench in there and hold on to the block and unscrew the nozzle. Now, depending on the design of your hot end assembly, that may not be feasible. You may have to take apart a portion of your printer to change a nozzle, and you have wires in the way. You risk damaging wires. You risk bending them. It just makes things more of a hassle. So if you plan on doing lots of nozzle changes, or even just the odd random one, don't look at the V6. And unfortunately, they kept this design for the Hemera. So I'm not looking at the Hemera because in reality, the Hemera is basically the exact same thing from the bottom with a heatsink that's attached to a motor that's now trying to cool the heater block and the motor. I'm not personally a fan of the Hemera. I don't believe it brings enough to the table to warrant looking into that. And also, it's not a hot end. It's mostly an extruder strap to a hot end. So this portion alone here really dates the V6 style. It makes it look antiquated. And for that, I definitely recommend these two over that if you plan on doing nozzle changes with any regularity. Now, when it comes to mounting, this is the biggest advantage of these two. With the Dragon and the Mosquito, they are capable of rigid mounting. So what that means is you can literally screw these to whatever you're mounting them to. Now on the Mosquito, you have the option of screwing it from the side. So you can mount it such as this, or you can screw it from the top, whereas the Dragon is only top mount capable. On the V6, we have groove mount. Now, the Dragon does come with an adapter for groove mount, but the first thing you should do when you get your Dragon is you remove these little screws, take your groove mount out, and throw it in the garbage, because groove mount, frankly, is antiquated and needs to go away. I have seen so many times on help forums for printers of people asking why they're having issues with their print, and it turns out their groove mount on their, especially RepRap printer, this is most common, has come loose. So now the nozzle and the whole hot end assembly has play in it. And I've seen it myself where I was new at printing, I printed a mount, everything was nice and tight, but after, a couple dozen hours of printing, the plastic had deformed ever so slightly, and now my hot end is no longer mounted. And also, when you go to do your nozzle changes, many times I have dealt with a hot end that decides to spin when you're trying to loosen a nozzle. So groove mount, while it is the simplest way of mounting, it's not really precise and rigid enough moving forward in 3D printing. So this method of removing the whole heater block and heatsink assembly from the mounting of the hot end is the biggest advantage of these two styles over the V6. And then you add on top of it the quick change nozzle, allowing you to do one-handed nozzle changes, which also comes from the rigid mounting. When it comes to high flow variants, the Mosquito and the Dragon simply extend the melt zone portion upwards, because again, your heater block ends here on both. So there is room to extend the melt zone up without changing the form factor of either hot end. Whereas with the V6, there really is no room to move up, so they have to move down. So with the Volcano or the Super Volcano, you simply add more mass below the heat break. This uses the same heater. The Super Volcano uses a larger heater. But again, all this extra weight and mass is now still sitting on the exact same heat break and is now more of a pivot point. So if you remember any of your physics classes, the closer something is to a point, when force is applied, there is less force on the point. So when you push that point further out, or even further out on the Super Volcano, if you have any nozzle strike while traveling, you're putting a lot of force on that heat break. When it comes to actual output, though, of the high flow variants, the Volcano variant actually does beat the Mosquito and the Dragon. However, for the average person, in my opinion, unless you absolutely need the increased volume of the Volcano, I would still stick with the high flow variant of the Mosquito or the Dragon, simply for the ease of use and potential reliability in the event that you do have a nozzle strike or any type of crash. The Volcano just seems more likely to break, in my opinion. And also the ability to use the same form factor, the same mounts. You're not really having to adjust. You're not losing Z-axis. I do feel that the Volcano is kind of, again, an antiquated way of doing a high flow hot end. Now, do you need a high flow variant? It really comes down to what you will be printing. Personally, I run normal flow variants on all my printers. I print with a 0.4 millimeter nozzle at 0.2 millimeter layer heights for about 99% of the prints I run. And I can run those variants at speeds up to about 150 millimeters per second at 0.4 nozzle, 0.2 layer height without outrunning the hot end. If you are one of those that wishes to run a 0.8 millimeter or a 1 millimeter nozzle, or you are pushing 300 millimeters per second constantly because you really want to run at the edge, then I would look into the high flow variants. But again, personally, I would stick to either the Mosquito or the Dragon and sacrifice a little bit of the output of the Volcano for the added reliability and ease of tuning. Because with the high flow variants, with the larger melt zone, you are going to have issues with more stringing and more oozing. So while you can remove most of those issues with proper tuning, that is something you are going to have to definitely pay attention to. So choice between the three, which one do I recommend? I will give pros and cons for all of them, and then I will leave with my final decision. So starting off with the V6, and I will say, if you are going with the V6, the only reason to go with the V6 is budget. Now, while a E3D V6, you are looking at about $70. The Triangle Labs V6, honestly, I can't tell a difference. I actually don't know which components on this are E3D, which are Triangle Labs. I have run both variants in printers with thousands of hours, and honestly, for comparing a Triangle Labs V6 with a titanium heat break for $15 versus a standard E3D V6 for $60 or $70, depending on where you are and where you're sourcing it from, I cannot recommend buying an E3D V6. There really is no advantage to buying it over a Triangle Labs, and the Triangle Labs V6 is only if you are really looking for a budget option. Now, again, all three do produce good prints, okay? So if you are going to take the time to tune a profile, all three of these will produce good prints. However, when it comes to all the other factors, other than cost, both these hot ends beat a V6. So if you are going to go with a V6 because you are looking to save, get a Triangle Labs V6, get the titanium heat break. Don't bother looking at an E3D. Unfortunately, their hot end from several years ago is still a hot end from several years ago. I'm waiting on them to come along with something better, but until then, I simply can't recommend buying an E3D V6. So the next one here would be the Dragon Hot End. So the reason to go for the Dragon Hot End is it is definitely an upgrade over the V6. Pretty much everything the Dragon does is better than a V6, other than cost. So we do have the same style of heater block, where we have the thermistor further away from the heater cartridge. And then we do have the copper heatsink. The melt zone is smaller than the Mosquito. So the output of the standard flow is a little bit less than a Mosquito, but still more than a V6. And we do have the rigid mounting. So if you are looking to spend a little bit more, the Dragon is definitely a very good, solid option. And last, we have the Mosquito Hot End. Now, the Mosquito Hot End does have the largest mount zone of these three hot ends, and personally, I do find I have had the most reliable hours on this hot end versus the other three. Now, the Dragon, I have very few hours on. This one is going to be installed in my Voron Zero soon. I've actually only run it once in my V2, just simply to make sure that it does work. However, simply throwing it in and running it with my Mosquito settings, the prints were pretty much the same. I couldn't tell any difference. And I've been running one of these in my V2 for a few thousand hours with absolutely zero issues. I haven't had any jams, any clogs. This thing has been 100% reliable for me. I cannot say the same of my V6s. I have run multiple V6s, E3D and Triangle Labs in Vorons, my V1, my V2. The odd clog, nozzle changes being a pain. I personally have had the best luck with the Mosquito. So when it comes to the Mosquito though, looking at the features, there are some drawbacks. Now, as you can see, this one still has a heater cartridge and thermistor installed. And the reason for that is I actually pulled this one out of a printer, and I'm not going to be taking these out because it's just an absolute pain to reinstall these with the boron paste and the mess. So that is a downside to these hot ends, is having to deal with the paste. If you do run out of paste, and I will say this stuff does, one tube will last you pretty much a lifetime, unless you're doing a heater swap every week. Then it might last, half a lifetime. But it is something, you're going to have to look into. If you lose the paste, you're going to have to order some more. You simply can't just undo a screw and swap your heater cartridge out. So that is something. And also, when it comes to the form factor, As you can see, comparing a normal block, such as on the V6 or the Dragon, to the Mosquito block, the Mosquito block is much wider. Now, it's not much bigger, but it's wider on the x-axis. Now, depending on how your cooling ducts are routed, we have noticed that this style does output more heat sideways, and we have noted a lot of melted ducts coming from printers running Mosquitoes. Now, we have redesigned the ducts and we have looked into alternate materials, so it's not really that much of a deal breaker of an issue, but depending on the design of your mount, that is something you're going to have to look into, is the fact that this puts out more heat sideways than these other two designs. So which one do I recommend? In terms of which one is the best, personally, even though with the boron paste and the wider heater block issue, putting more heat out sideways and melting some ducts, personally, if I only had to run one hot end for the rest of my life, I would stick with the Mosquito. However, I already have this Mosquito and it is bought and paid for. If I am building a printer, I'm going with the Dragon. The reason for that is it comes down to price and benefits. This is double, if not more, the price of this. Performance-wise, they're within a margin of error percentage. This is easier to work on. It's easier to swap heater cartridges. It's easier to swap thermistors. If you do want to mount this in a printer that currently takes a V6, you can use the groove mount. Groove mount needs to die. And it is just hard to recommend the Mosquito over the Dragon when, again, it's such a big price difference. So while this is, and you can argue this to the cows come home, this is a better hot end than the Dragon, it is not double the price better. It may be a couple dollars, $10, $20 better, but not double the price better than a Dragon. So for building your printer, I will recommend a Dragon hot end. Now, this is actually the hot end I have the least amount of time on. I will be full and upfront about this, but these ideas that I'm passing to you are based on not only my opinion, but opinions of others that I have noticed in several forums, and I'm trying to give a abject, real world comparison between these three and not just comparing, static prints. I'm comparing, having used these two specifically for thousands of hours, what I would recommend, and that would be the Dragon. So I hope you have enjoyed this video. This is a subject that does come up quite frequently in the Voron Discord, which if you haven't joined yet, please go to vorondesign.com and follow the link for our Discord. It is an active and growing community. And I felt getting my opinion out there would help others when it comes to their choice of which hot end to choose for building their printer. If you would like to see more content such as this, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. And if you do have any further questions, please feel free to ask them in the comments below. I do make it a point to try and answer as many of those as I can. Thank you, be safe, wash your hands, and have a great day.